LGBTQ people of color have a long history of erasure, from a whitewashed stone wall to the preponderance of whiteness in LGBTQ media. The LGBTQ narrative often lacks the diversity of the community that it represents. Since LGBTQ people of color live in the intersection of marginalized categories that include race, sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression, they are often more likely to experience violence when compared to their white peers. Consider that 90% of the 49 people who lost their lives during a mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, were Latino. Yet, that's not the story that the mainstream media focused on. Take a look at these clips from the days following the shooting.
But what Noor Salman knows is key to finding out what happened.
29-year-old Omar Mateen, a self-proclaimed ISIS supporter, armed with a .223 caliber AR-type rifle and a Glock 17 9mm handgun.
The focus of the attack seemed to be on the shooter's possible connections to international terror groups rather than the victims.
There are two major situations the nation must deal with in the interest of your public safety, keeping you and the people you care about safe from random violence. First, the Islamic Jihad. Second, guns.
Even national leaders failed to mention the victims' identities.
We grieve for the victims, and we say this to their families and to Orlando. You're not alone. Your nation is here with you, and we won't back down in the face of terrorism.
When the story did focus on Orlando, most of the people invited to speak about the shooting on major networks weren't Latino, LGBTQ, or both. The day after the Orlando massacre, a Media Matters study tracked guest appearances on MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News, and found that guests representing intersectional communities were underrepresented across all three networks. This erasure of intersectional identities is important because it hides the realities that LGBTQ people of color face. For example, take into account that LGBTQ people of color are more vulnerable to hate crimes. A hate crime, or a bias-related crime, is motivated by prejudice towards a certain group. According to data from the FBI and the Williams Institute, LGBT people experience the highest rate of reported hate crimes in the United States. In 2014, 37% of survivors were under the age of 30, and about 60% of survivors were under the age of 40. That year, 80% of reported LGBT homicides victimized people of color. And of all the murders of LGBT people in the last 3 years, the majority of homicide victims were trans people of color. For example, in 2015, 95% of trans people killed were people of color, almost all of them under the age of 35. When members of this community do report to the police, things often don't go very well. A 2015 survey found that 39% of LGBTQ hate crime survivors were met with hostility when they tried to report, and 41% were met with indifference. However, remember that these are only reported hate crimes. A 2012 report by the United States Department of Justice cites that 60% of hate crimes were not reported to the police. In fact, a recent investigation by the Associated Press found that thousands of city police and county sheriff's departments had not filed a single hate crime report to the FBI between 2009 and 2014. This lack of reporting is often due to fear of discrimination and stigma. Mindy Daniels is a public defender. In the 80s and 90s, she was a prominent LGBT rights leader in Washington, D.C. Even though today underreporting is an issue, back then it was even worse.
A lot of people didn't want to report a bias-related crime. They felt it was bad enough they were the victim of a crime.
DC's Bias-Related Crime Act of 1989 leads the country in progressive hate crime laws, and Daniels expects that passing similar legislation nationwide is the next step of the LGBTQ rights movement.
And I think that it's going to become more of a priority than it has been because gay marriage has passed. And people were very committed to that. There was a lot of energy, effort, and money going into that. And now that we have that, I do think the next thing is bias-related crimes legislation.
Mindy's not just an advocate for hate crime protections. She was the victim of a hate crime herself.
I was kissing my date goodbye, and a car drove up, so we were driver to driver, and he called me names. He called me muffin, he called me a lot of different, anti lesbian slurs. And then he pulled out a gun, and from about, I don't know, 2 feet maybe, he stuck that gun between my forehead, had his finger on the trigger, and winked at me like he was going to pull the trigger. But didn't. He thought it was very funny, he put away his gun, and drove off. Me being me, I told my date to get out of the car. I made a U-turn and I followed him.
Mindy recorded her assailant's license plate number and pressed charges, even after pulling strings with her political relationships as an LGBT rights leader to get it charged as a hate crime. She lost her case.
So what about the person that has no relationship? And what about some poor person? What about some black person who is afraid even to have it charged as a hate crime because they don't want people to know that they're gay? I mean, think about that. That was happening a lot.
But times are changing, especially for young people.
I think that now a lot more people are out, a lot more people are comfortable with being out. I think that people are more apt to report a bias-related crime.
A recent study by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 7% of young Americans identify as LGBT, and many suggest that this number will rise. But as more and more Americans openly identify as LGBT, the threat of discrimination grows, and so does the threat of erasing LGBT people of color. So, what's going to fix this? Let's start with looking at our 3 branches of the federal government. The Obama administration has demonstrated support for LGBTQ protections, as has the Supreme Court by affirming the constitutionally protected right for marriage equality. But things get iffy when it comes to Congress. The Equality Act, introduced in Congress in 2015, would establish increased protections for all LGBTQ people by creating explicit protections against discrimination based on an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. That's just on the federal level. Check out the individual states. According to Movement Advancement Project, only 17 states and the District of Columbia have hate crime laws that include sexual orientation as well as gender identity. This means that only 39% of the LGBT population in the United States live in states with laws covering these 2 identity markers. While this data doesn't account for the inclusion of gender expression as a protected identity marker, the number of states that protect gender expression is even lower. In order to get all LGBTQ people the protection they deserve, they and their allies must call for comprehensive hate crimes legislation in each of our 50 states and in municipalities across America.
Don't settle for non-inclusive legislation. Get it right the first time. Don't have to go back and amend. Don't make a bias-related crimes act take 10 years to get it right. Get it right to begin with. I think that the way to do that is to follow your human rights laws. Make sure that they're inclusive, so you'd want to start there.
We must all remember that even though the LGBTQ community has gained marriage equality, the journey for full equality has just begun. By advocating for stronger non-discrimination and hate crimes legislation in your city or town, and by holding your representatives accountable through the power of your vote, you are doing your part in making progress happen.